Cool. Okay, right. I'm going to give you a talk about Chiptune and you, and also me. So my name's James, and this presentation is basically part of one which I sort of glommed onto another one, basically, because I was like, oh no, I need to do a presentation, and the first part of it is actually sort of like the history of games consoles and things. I'm kind of sure you know some of that, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's fun. And it's always good to be reminded of things, and plus I've got gifts, so there's one. That's a games console thingy. It should be doing something. Yeah. And why can't I see my notes? There. Oh. That's much easier. So that's 1977. That's the Magnavox. It was a games console which plugged into a TV, which was revolutionary at the time. It didn't make any sound though, and not many of the binatone consoles did. But you could play with an oscillating frequency, which was a light which bounced around your screen, and it was all very low tech, and everyone was in these days not very impressed by moving a light around an analog tube. However, in 1977, that was the best. But things quickly progressed from there, and there was a bleep heard around the world, and that made a sound from a little TV. And the linking of games and audio was pretty much that. The paddle heard around the world, apparently. But as things carried on, things got more exciting. And a little thing called the Atari 2600 came out. A bit more American, really. We didn't really have, well, we did have them. But it was quite exciting for everyone involved, really. It was in your home. It had a little chip in it called the TIA, which is Television Interface Adapter. And that made lots of sounds. It made beautiful sounds in some cases, but it also made horrible sounds if you used it in the wrong way. Lots of and etc. However, again, images on your screen and sounds coming out of your TV, which you had a direct control of. Kids were slotting these under their TVs, etc. And it was all getting good. And at the same, well, not at the same time, but at sort of, yeah, at the same time, there was also this happening in the arcades. And from 1980 to like the 1990s, there was a massive arms race of let's make arcade games to steal your quarters. And at the same time, with all these loud sounds coming out of arcades throughout the country in America, on the beachfront in the UK, because you can't really find many arcades in inland for some reason. I don't know why they're relegated to beaches. But the chips inside these, which made sounds, were getting smaller and smaller, and they were starting to come from the world of like personal computers. So those were starting to get sound chips inside them, and also there were things like personal keyboards at home, where you could like play a little Yamaha keyboard, and then suddenly that little chip making the sound in that Yamaha keyboard would be slammed in the back of an arcade machine with some FM synthesis. Try saying that fast, and your arcade games would have the same sounds coming out of them. It's all very inspiring for young people. But in 1985, something else happened. There were these cool kids playing with this robot, and that controller probably tells you all you need to know is that that's the NES console. That has a beautiful sound chip inside it, and also it was released in 1985, which is ironically when I was born as well. So, fun fact there, and the games changed, they got more complex, and I'm pretty sure that if I showed you that, a little melody went in your head, and I was going to get you all to do it, but don't really want to have that much audience participation just yet. But the games changed, they sounded better. The chip in there is a 2A03, I think, is a 4-channel sound chip. Looks like that. You've got 2 sound saw waves going on there. You've got a triangle wave and a noise at there. And I don't know how well you can read that, but that's actually playing the Zelda theme at the moment. That's what it looks like. Ironically, I also did a presentation about music and then didn't put any sound in it. That's what happens when you're in a rush. Also, it's actually got 5 sound channels. Not many people know that apart from cool kids, but there's a sample channel which is also available, which is usually direct access from the cartridge, goes into the NES, and you can play back very low rate samples because it's an 8-bit machine, so that's pretty much the limit of your samples, but the samples are actually going to be even less than that to just save on space, because there really isn't much space on a NES cartridge. And also in Japan, they were very lucky in games like Castlevania 3 has an extra sound chip in the game cartridge itself to give you another 2 channels of sound, making absolutely lush, warm, beautiful sounds coming out of that. But anyway, that's pretty much the sound of youth to me. But then also, this happened. So I was playing NES games in my parents' front room, and it was also my front room. I don't know why it was just my parents. But I also had a time limit there. That sucked. It would be basically I want to watch Ghostbusters James to get off the TV, stop playing Mario. But this fun little thing, the Game Boy, came out in 1989. It's actually 4-bit sound. It's not 8-bit. So all these people going, "Oh, I'll make 8-bit sounds on my Game Boy," they're liars. But it's basically the same-ish sound chip. It's another 4 channels, but also I could sit in my room and play this for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. And this was my favourite game, not Rick Mail. Oh, he's so slow. I need to record these much better. Here we go. Oh, yeah, there he is. Oh. So I do love Rick Mail, and also I love Zelda, because that was an adventure which I could have with headphones in my room, or in a caravan in wet, soggy Cornwall, when, you know, what else is there to do in Cornwall in the rain in a caravan? But this was 1991, around then sort of time, but it felt that games were always meant to be aimed at kids at this time, and Rick Mail in his fancy house. But there was also a cultural impact also happening, so the people who'd grown up maybe with the arcades, or maybe with the 2600, were also cottoning on to the fact that video games these days, or in 90s, were big business. So stuff like this started happening. I remember seeing this on Top of the Pops. This is the Ambassadors of Funk, German group, with their hit single Super Mario Land. That was in 1992. And for all the more cool Warp Records people, someone else made a thing called Power Pill Pac-Man, and that's a guy called Richard D. James, aka Aphex Twin. So that's quite exciting. In the early 90s, people were already making like hit singles out of video games, essentially, just by sampling the sounds and playing them back through samplers, or just making bad raps over the top of them. Let's carry on. Something else happened in 1990, this was. A home console came out with an FM chip inside, and that would be the Sega Mega Drive, which most people think has terrible sound. I actually think it's got quite nice sound. So it just depends on how you use it. A lot of the times, Mega Drive games kind of sounded like a bad fart. But inside one of them, it's a Yamaha chip inside, the same ones which you used on just like home keyboards with that demo button that played Venus. Mine used to play, actually. I Am Your Fire, Your Desire, etc. And there was a bit of an arms race going on between Sega and Nintendo, but Nintendo had this fun little thing. And on the SNES used sound fonts, which is essentially a bit like MIDI on your like 90s computers, where you'd have a set bank of sounds and then it would just play it back. So it's almost getting away from the idea of what chiptune might be, but also it's still using the game hardware. It's still a 16-bit sampler, basically, playing back these things, and it's got a very traditional weird funk sound which you could hear and stuff, and like that weird guitar sound when it goes but that's that, and that's actually playing Get Lucky at the moment. But anyway, so we're piling on through the 90s. That was probably 1992, and then in 1995 Sony ruined everything. Ironically, they made things quite good with the SNES, because that's a Sony built sound chip, but then there's that thing with the Sony Nintendo SNES and stuff like that. But then Sony went off and did that. That's got a CD-ROM drive in it, and it's kind of the end of the sound chip in games hardware, in a sense, because if you've got a CD drive, you've got all that space, you can put a cool WAV file on there. Some games still use like MIDI-esque sounds, Final Fantasy VII, horrible sound, but good soundtrack. However, a little bit about me was that I got a bit obsessed with this thing. And I don't know if anyone recognises that little guy. Does anyone recognise that little guy? His music, well, it's not Music 2000. I was more of a 1998 kind of person. That was from music creation for the PlayStation. And I got a bit obsessed with that. And that was actually the first piece of musical hardware, like thing I ever actually had to compose on, other than I don't know what else I had. I had a crap keyboard, but I could only ever play the Chippendales theme on that. That gave me the opportunity to make really bad industrial music, which was just snare drums over and over again. And so the PlayStation essentially gave you this creative tool using samples, and it's not quite chiptune, it's not really what I'm talking about here, but that was sort of my musical, the first thing that ever inspired me to make music. And then time wore on. 2000 brought this thing called like the soundtrack to games, really. And you know, there was licensing starting getting involved, and like you just start getting big name artists. So Vice City had was the first proper really big licensed soundtrack game. And but I found this one. That's David Morales. He does this cool little dance. He says at the same time, two, and then he says, "is for you." The MTV Music Generator 2. That was basically the same as music, but it was on PlayStation 2, and it actually had a sampler built into it, so you could plug a USB sampler into your PlayStation 2 and then start rapping into it. Wow. And it would be good. Interesting anyway. But there were things like EA Big, where they would license big soundtracks to like Song 2 into the intro of FIFA, and Final Fantasy X had a metal song at the beginning for God knows why. But let's go a little back. Let's rewind it. And in 1985, the first demo scene was happening with Commodore 64s. This isn't from 1985, this is from 1994. The demo scene, I don't know whether you're aware of it. You probably are, because everyone seems to be nerds these days anyway. I don't really know why I start explaining things. But the demo scene is basically pushing games hardware to the limit of what it can actually do, and then they have like cool demo fights and code offs where they make the most radical 3D graphics on something that really shouldn't do that. But it's really exciting because also they usually had banging techno music at the same time, produced at the same time. So Commodore 64s, Amigas, all sorts were starting being used to make like interesting graphics and sound and things. But also it was teaching people that, you know, these games consoles, they're there to be used, not just played with. And it started a scene of things like homebrew and also like emulation in a way. So in the early 2000s, by reverse engineering things like the NES, reverse engineering the Game Boy and all things like that, and getting things running on old hardware and things going backwards and forwards, it started creating quite an exciting time. The burgeoning internet basically gave birth to scenes and groups of people who were hacking away at stuff and then getting programs to run on older games consoles and vice versa. And that's where things started getting really interesting, because in 2005, this was released. This is called Little Sound DJ. Anyone seen Little Sound DJ before? He's nodding. So a little bit like the Ableton Live, this is actually a song going down, and then you've got two channels. You've got your two sawtooth waves there. You've got a wave channel, which is actually the triangle channel, and noise. And those are all the notes it's playing on the side, and then you can navigate it using that. And that is basically an entire music sequencer which you can control with one of those. So using two buttons and a D-pad, which is very exciting. And you can also use start and select for something. I can't remember. I actually can't use trackers very well because they've got two fiddly screens, and I'm not very good at actually seeing what I'm doing or anything like that. But lucky for James, there is also this one. This one is called Nano Loop, and this is a much easier thing to read. But this is running on a Game Boy as well. But this uses a bespoke cartridge. They come looking like this these days, but they used to be able to be flashed onto other cartridges like that. And what that is a sort of like a pattern editor. So one step back from the song, this is just a part of a song, and you can skip between it. You can add notes. You can change the BPM. You can change the width of the pulses. You can, if you've got the FM on the Game Boy Advance version, you can change the frequency modulations. So that came out in 2002, and then other people were getting involved. That's a very bored-looking individual, but that's a chap called Pixel Hate, which is a great name. He created a thing called the Pixel Hate Pro Performer, which is on the Game Boy and actually lets you just press the buttons on your Game Boy, so you can sit here and press the buttons and you make notes, which is pretty cool. And I think that's pretty rad. And a lot of other people thought it was pretty rad. All of those people thought it was rad. More of them as well, a lot more of them. So around 2000, the mid-2000s, 2009, it sort of took off as a scene, really. There was bands playing with Game Boys, there was individual artists, there was art people just making weird graphics behind there, there were people using different bits of hardware to make this lots and lots of different forms of music. They were playing outside, they were playing in clubs, and I think that's all pretty rad. So what do you actually need to do that? I've obviously inspired you. First thing you need is to make sure that your GIFs are running like that. So you've decided to use a Game Boy to make music. First of all, you need to know how to get the cartridges. These cartridges you just buy off the internet, and they've got the software installed, but there's also flash carts. And once you've got a flash cart, you need a USB cable. You didn't used to. You used to have to burn the ROM onto the cart and then hope it copied across okay. But things got better with USB. So USB makes everything better. That's a Dragon Derp cart, which is a fantastic name. But there's also EverDrives and the like. And that will help you get your tracker. So that's a different tracker. This one's called FamiTracker, actually. And FamiTracker is for using NES sound chips. And what you can do with this one is once you've made your track, you can export it to an NSF file, and then you can load that onto a cartridge. You plonk that into your NES, and then your NES sings for you. It's beautiful. But once you've learned how to use one of these, you can actually use different trackers, and you can sort of pass the knowledge across a bit, like if you know how to use
Renoise, is that another one?
yeah, Renoise is a big tracker. I think Renoise you can use all VSTs and stuff with it, can't you? It's fantastic. There's one called Piggy Tracker as well, which is great because you can use it on the Raspberry Pi. There's one called Sunvox as well, which has got a tracker built in. Yeah, so that's all pretty cool, and I like to take things a little bit more hardware related. So I like getting things with MIDI, and you can do that with a Game Boy. So that is called a Arduino boy, and it uses an Arduino board. Do you say Arduino or Arduino? I don't know. But either way, you can build these circuits, and what you use is the link ports on the sides of the Game Boy, and you then address that with MIDI data, which is translated via the Arduino into a thing called MGB, and then you can simply use a hardware keyboard to play your Game Boy like it was just any other instrument. And then what else do you need? You need to just then plug your Game Boy into something, and it makes lovely noise. It's beautiful. There's also this thing. It's called a MIDI NES. It was developed, and you can barely get them anymore. But a guy basically built all these MIDI NES cartridges where you just plug it in, and then you plug the other end into your keyboard, and then away you go. The problem being is that that's actually pitched towards NTSC TVs, and if you know anything about the way analog TVs used to work, that's about 10% faster than PAL TVs, which means that when you play C on that without actually pressing your Game Boy to put it into PAL mode, you can make a horrible out of tune C, which has ruined several gigs for me. But until I noticed and then did the cool combo on the thing. But once you've got MIDI, then the world is your oyster, really. You can use this weird piece of software called Ableton Live. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's pretty cool though, because you can just then use external instruments through Ableton Live. You output into your audio card, you send the MIDI out, and then you get the audio back in from the outputs of the console, and you're making chiptune. You're making fun stuff, but you're also controlling it with your computer, so you don't really have to worry about those tiny little screens. Because also, you might have noticed that that's a very, very small screen, and if you don't know Game Boys, this one has a backlight put into it, because I'm cool, but also because you can't see the damn screen in any lighting condition other than perfect strip lighting of a Japanese factory. So, however, you might also notice that the sound of these consoles is not actually the best. And I mean that in the way that there's probably a ton of background noise in these things. So in the back of a NES, they put the audio output, if you're using the audio output, or the video output, and any of that stuff, is right next to where the power amplifier is. And there's no shielding between those two things, which means it sits there and goes for ages. So you might want to get a little bit handy, open up your classic games console, do a bit of soldering, and add a thing called a Pro sound to it. It's not actually that hard because they're relics of the early 90s, late 80s, and you can actually access all the circuit boards inside them and desolder things and pull them apart and stuff. It's great fun. Don't break your things. And also, you are dealing with mains electricity, so I should give a safety warning. There is like a weird static thing coming off my NES at the moment, and I just ignore it. But it's all these things go towards, all the lessons learned here come online, and you can learn this by finding tutorials, by finding YouTube videos. And it really is actually quite an accessible scene once you just know what to Google, basically, how do I chiptune? And you can find your way quite easily. Then you need to just get in there, really. Start burning solder, start hacking apart your NES, doing all sorts of things which you shouldn't do. And the interesting thing is that this sort of burst around like that in mid-2000s, 2009, and that was sort of around the same time when people started really thinking about indie games as a thing, where technology had sort of caught up that you could easily start making games. And what kind of games did people start making? They started making games that looked a bit like that, which is cool to me. That is Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. You can't download it anymore because of licensing issues, ironically due to the soundtrack license, I believe, or maybe it's the film license, I can't remember. But the soundtrack to that was done by Anna Managuchi, who are a chiptune, not really anymore, but they made chiptune rock. And the whole soundtrack was composed on guitars and a NES, and etc., which was very, very good. And if you look at the soundtrack, it's a very good soundtrack. Other ones, things like, what's that one? Shovel Knight. I like Shovel Knight. That's good. That's got a great soundtrack as well. But it's going into this aesthetic, which was sort of fitting in with, at the time as games were becoming like, oh, I can make a game. I grew up playing NES games, I grew up playing SNES games. Let's make pixel games, and let's make them sound like pixel games. Why not? It's kind of easy. We've got all the tools. People hacked them apart a few years ago, and now we can just access all of this information and create authentic sounding sounds. That's a great thing. But also, I think it also went in line with basically our generation growing up. I say ours, most of you are around my age. I have judged your age now, it's fine. And people wearing pixel ties, people, having gaming t-shirts and having little one-ups, and you can go into Tesco's and buy a Mario t-shirt, etc. But back to chiptune, it wasn't like this was some new thing, because other artists had also noticed that. So these are some #popular artists. I don't know, do you know who that one is at the top? No? Alec Empire, he's awesome. He's a very angry German guy. From Atari Teenage Riot, ironically called Atari Teenage Riot, from the 90s. And he also released a Game Boy album in like 1999 just called Nintendo Teenage Robots, which he used the random music generating game on the Game Boy camera to make breakbeat. So, pretty cool. Also Beck, I like Beck. And Bjork has also used these sounds from things like Pixel Hate's Pro Performer, from LSDJ. I think the example of it I can think of off the top of my head is Beck's, if you listen to Girl by Beck, it's got basically a Game Boy intro in it. So that's cool. You're all excited. You want to be like Beck. We all want to be like Beck. But it actually does cost quite a lot of money. This is an issue with Chiptune, is that these Game Boys these days, there's lots of them. There was about 20 million of them made, so you can find them. Still cost you 20 quid. Then you've got to get a cartridge. Now these are a bit more expensive because they're bespokely made, and so you're looking at another 30, 40 pounds maybe for one of those, and if you get stuck by customs, which I keep getting stuck by customs, you have to pay a bit more. That's exciting, so that's your flash cart, but then you also want to make sure it sounds good. So you have to modify that, you have to open up your £20 Game Boy, and suddenly a £20 Game Boy is a £20 brick, and you need to buy another £20 Game Boy. Or you need to spend £80 and get your friend to do it because you know him online. And there's quite a few people, if you know a guy, I know a guy. That's cool. Yeah, and that MIDI NES which I showed you, they don't get made anymore, and the guy got involved in a bit of a scam, and you can get them on eBay for about £350. So, crazy. And also, I've got to learn stuff, and that takes time. I hate learning, but I love learning things. So, you want to make chiptunes right now, you want to be cool, you can use VSTs, and these are all in Ableton. You can download them. I think the best one I came across is one called Plogue, which is a good name. It's Plogue. There's another one called Minibit, which is that one. And they kind of authentically recreate the sound of the sound chips, which I was talking about earlier. The thing which you've got to just really remember is that if you want to make authentic sounds, it's actually quite easy to make a square wave. You can do it. I picked up this book from my bookshelf this morning, because this is called Handmade Electronic Music, and I recommend it to anyone because it's a great book. Read this book? Anyone? No? Get this book, it's great. It's all about hacking apart toys, adding oscillators into them, how to basically do circuit bending, but also build your own synths, because all you really need is a simple clock chip. Then you need like a resistor and something else which I've forgotten the name of because I'm talking too much. But you plug that in, and then you just make a noise, and then you add a variable resistor into it, and then you go. That's all a circuit really is. Really, it's just power, little clock going off and on, and a thing to pick up the sound. So you've got to think about your composition. That's what I was trying to get at before I started rambling about homemade circuits. Also, homemade circuits are incredibly loud sometimes, so don't plug them into that. You will hurt yourself. So you think about the composition. NES games, they have those 4 channels which you used to have. The saw channel, the 2 saw channels, the triangle, the noise channel, and then your sample channel if you're lucky. So you've got to think about how you actually compose music using that. So if you think you've got 4 channels, what are you going to do if you need a chord? You can either use 2 of those channels to play 2 notes at once, and then you've got your bass coming out of the triangle wave, and then you've got a coming from the noise. Or you could use an arpeggio, which goes really fast to play all the notes you could possibly imagine in that chord on 1 channel. Or you can also cut that channel into pieces and then start playing the bass on the same channel. So you start layering your notes into 1 channel to make the most of it. It's all very exciting. But I would basically recommend you do that, because if you want to be cool and use chiptunes in your 8-bit pixel game, or any other game really, it's a fantastic sound, that you want to think about how they compose, because you can easily go overboard with it. And I say that as a person who easily goes overboard all of the time, particularly on GIFs. Because I don't know why I put this in there really. I've got a thing which says what is real anyway, so I think I'm going to go off on one like an Alan Watts conversation and just start talking about the nature of time. LSDJ, you can also run it in an emulator, so you don't need a Game Boy to learn how to use it. You can. It's $5 to download. That supports the creator to keep going on, and quite frankly, we're all using tools such as MacBook Pros and tablets and mobile phones, these things. So there is a sense of why would you look for an authentic sound from a Nintendo Game Boy what is it that actually drives some people to hack apart these consoles and create stuff? And quite frankly, I'm not too sure. I just quite enjoy it, really. It's a challenge. It's fun using hardware. It gives it a unique flavour, I think, and it's a unique way of approaching music as a, can I use this box to create something? Just as I used to use my PlayStation to create music using that weird old software from Jester Interactive. That was enough to inspire me to create something. So it's not really about the hardware which you use, but it's about the thing that inspires you to create something. I guess that's what drives me anyway. So I haven't actually really talked much about me. That's my music setup at the moment. That's a NES. There's 2 Game Boys in there. I use a Game Boy Advance because Game Boy Advances sound better to my discerning ear. But there's also a Game Boy, and there's also 2 mini synth units there. One's a Shruti, one's a Meeblip. And over there in the squiggle zone over there, that is a MIDI Game Boy, Arduino boy. So that gives MIDI out to there, and then all the cables go back in there, and basically comes out my sound card. So if I had it in front of you, it would just go into the laptop, and then it would go into Ableton, and then I'd program everything via MIDI, and then play it back through all of this, which is quite fun. That's how I work most of the time. It's like an exciting thing. Also, you might notice there is a guitar. I play guitar like it's being pulled through a hedge backwards, but I quite enjoy it. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. I also use a lot of other things. There's lots of other like inspiring little gadgets out there these days. So I use pocket operators, if you've come across them. They are brilliant, particularly some of them. Not the Office one. The Office one's terrible. But the arcade one is great fun to play with. And the factory synth and the bass synth. And they're about the same size as half of my phone. And they look like pocket calculators. And they're brilliant at just jamming out ideas. Also, they have amazing clock sync on them. So one thing, which I should mention, is that these are very low-powered devices, and that means when you're running something like Nanoloop on there, it's not going to actually stay in time with a modern bit of hardware, particularly if it's running off its own clock. So you either need to sync it to something, so you get the notes coming in at the same rate as everything else is happening, or you're going to have a mess within about 5 minutes where everything is out of sync. So pocket operators, on the other hand, have amazing clock sync. I don't quite know, I think it's Voodoo, but it's good. So phone apps, you can download Nanoloop on your phone. That's pretty good. I think it's like £5 on the App Store. Fantastic little synthesizer's got samplers built into it, but it also uses the same interface of very short, easy to use, just like make notes, etc. That's my website address down there. I don't know why I put it in here because I've actually got another slide. The other things which I do, I play with DS10, which is on the DS, obviously, DS10. I also made a book because that is actually what I do for a living, is graphic design and UIs and UX design. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. But also I just wanted at the hidden over here, that's a tiny little one there. Oh my words. It's called a Bastel Castle synth, I think. But it's a very little modular. It's a very tiny modular. It's about the same size as that cup of tea. So that's good. And I also wanted to shout out to a few interesting things. So weeklybeats.com is the thing which I do, in which you submit a track every single week for a year. So what week are we on? 39? We're on week 39. So I'm very tired and I'm wired on coffee, if you couldn't tell. But that's a fantastic community of people. A lot of them make chiptune because they're just inspired by just being able to create things very quickly. And it's part of the whole democratization of basically everything that's occurred in the world, is that you can now have 100 insanely talented musicians, and James, submit things every week. And a lot of it is fantastic and brilliant. So if you need to find some royalty-free music as well, a lot of them use Creative Commons licenses. So I don't know if they know that to tick the correct boxes, but almost who cares? It's a great way of finding stuff. Mu Collective, it says U Collective, but it's the Mu sort of sound.org. That's exciting. When it's actually live, it's a forum and music submission site. Nanoloop.de, that's where you buy Nanoloop. And that is the end of my little presentation. So thank you very much. Do you want to see some chiptune?
Yeah.
Hooray! This is going to be really hard. One, the cartridge won't go in. There we go. So this is a Game Boy. And it's not loading already. So this is why you don't use retro hardware for presentations. Oh, that's awful.
That's the method.
Hey. Oh, does it load? That's the other question. Come on. This is why it was a last minute edition. Let's try the cartridge. I wanted to be able to show you Nanoloop. Let's try Nanoloop Mono. Now Nanoloop Mono is interesting because they found a secret sound chip inside Game Boys where you can actually address one of the pins with more sound, basically coming directly from. Don't do live demos, James. Don't do them. It's not going to work. It's broken. Fantastic. Well done, Game Boy. Oh, it is working. Oh, maybe I'm not so boned. It's an extra sound to basically turn it into a mono synth, which is very interesting. So, volume up. Hey! So, making a little beep, little blips there. So you can add more beeps. So you can see the pattern sequence just runs through, and then you can just add your notes quite easily. And I don't really know what notes I'm adding, but you can just keep adding more and more notes to it until you start making a rhythm, and then you change the channel and say, "Oh, I don't know what that one." Yeah. Oh, it's beautiful. These things, you know.
That's awesome.
C. There we go.
So you could sync, say, 5 of you together, or the clock can be synced between the Game Boys. Is that
Yeah, you can sync them all together. Oh, here we go.
because if they're all equally bad clocks, then the clock would be okay.
Also,
or does it not work?
you can sync them together, and they send clock to each other.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's one of the nicer things.
It'd be an idea to have one master clock then.
Yeah, you
and then
can.
the rest
From a pocket operator.
You can use a pocket operator as a master clock send, and also those Korg monotribes and things like that can all use it. Yeah, that's just going to keep making sound until I turn it off. Yeah, I'm just going to keep going now. So yeah, there you go. That's
Cool.
how to make chiptune incredibly quickly, and I hope I've inspired you to make some pixel art and then make some pixel beats to go with it.
Yeah.